Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy disappearances. In each of these cases, there is one really disturbing piece of information that makes it seem as though there's more to the story. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. These days, Phoenix, Arizona is often referred to as the kidnapping capital of the United States, but nearly a century ago, that same title belonged to Tacoma, Washington due to a series of high-profile cases. In 1935, timber tycoon John Philip Weyerhaeuser's 9-year-old son George was snapped off a busy Tacoma street in broad daylight. He was eventually reunited with his family after his father paid a $200,000 ransom, but sadly, the following year, the 10-year-old son of a prominent physician, William Matson, was abducted and murdered. At the time, 8-year-old Beverly Ann Leach and her family also lived in Tacoma. In fact, she and her friends even often rode their bikes past William's home out of morbid curiosity. After high school, though, Bev set out for Seattle to study at the University of Washington. She always dreamed of being a journalist, but things changed when she fell in love with a young man named Anne Burr. Bev and Don then got married and eventually moved to California, where their first child, Anne, was born on December 14, 1952. Later, they moved back to North Tacoma, Washington, and when it was all said and done, they had 3 more children, Julie, Greg, and Mary. The family was a devout Catholic family, and they lived normal middle-class lives in their quaint 2-story bungalow on North 14th Street. Most residents knew one another and took pride in their community, and more importantly, North Tacoma was relatively safe despite the kidnappings that occurred decades before. Weather permitting, many children walked to and from school every day, and on afternoons and weekends, the kids often played together in the orchard next door until the sun went down or the parents called them in for supper. With that said, like all communities, North Tacoma also had its fair share of odd and eccentric characters. One neighborhood man allegedly handed out candy to neighborhood kids while sunbathing without clothes in his backyard. The family was also wary of a woman who lived across the street because, according to the rumor mill, she'd recently been released from a mental institution. Then, in the summer of 1961, a suspicious door-to-door cookware salesman showed up in North Tacoma and hung around a bit too long for everyone's liking. The residents who listened to his unconvincing sales pitch generally agreed that he was actually casing the neighborhood for some nefarious purpose. But in any case, the weather was unseasonably warm and humid in late August of 1961. With summer vacation coming to an end, the children spent most of Wednesday, August 30th playing with their friends. Meanwhile, the then 33-year-old Bev was busy making sure they'd have everything they needed when the new school year started. When the kids were ready to turn in at 8 p.m., Bev told Greg and Julie they could sleep in a fort they'd made in the basement. Then, since Julie and Anne shared a room upstairs, Bev told Mary she could sleep in the room with her big sister. The children all fell asleep pretty quickly, and a few minutes before 11 p.m., Dawn put the family's dog out on the patio beside the kitchen. By then, Bev was also already in bed, and after putting the dog out, Dawn locked the door, latched the safety chain, and made sure the downstairs windows were all closed. The house was all locked up with one seemingly minor exception. One window wasn't closed all the way because the cable from the TV to the antenna on the roof ran through it. It looked like it was closed from the outside, but the cable was just thick enough to prevent it from being fully locked. Before heading upstairs, Dawn checked on the kids in the basement one last time. It's unclear what time it was, but at some point in the night, Anne went into her parents' room, woke her mother, and told her that Mary was crying. This didn't surprise Bev because Mary had recently broken her arm and it was still on and off painful. After lulling her daughter back to sleep, Bev went back to the master bedroom and dozed off. Later that night, North Tacoma was hit by a powerful thunderstorm that blew down trees, utility lines, and left hundreds of homes and businesses without power. Bev and Dawn were woken up multiple times throughout the night because of the storm and by the dog's sporadic barking. But even still, Bev would manage to get a few solid hours of sleep before getting up and going to the basement to check on Julie and Greg at approximately 5:15 a.m. Afterwards, she went back upstairs to check on Anne and Mary, but to her surprise, Anne's bed was empty. This was a little odd because it wasn't like her to get up so early, but Bev assumed she was using the bathroom or getting something to drink in the kitchen. However, it soon became apparent that Anne was nowhere to be found, and her mother panicked when she noticed that the front door was open, that one of the living room windows was also wide open, and that a stool that had been in the garden the day before was lying on its side under the open window. At that moment, she burst out of the house, ran to several neighbors' homes, banged on their doors, and asked if they'd seen Anne. Unfortunately, though, nobody had any idea where she was. Tacoma detectives arrived at the family home at about 7 a.m. shortly after Bev reported Anne missing. By then, she and Dawn were absolutely frantic, but they did their best to contain their emotions for the sake of their other children. Bev began by telling the detectives what she found after waking up. She also told them that she and Don had been hearing strange sounds in the yard at night, and that leading up to that night, a few neighbors claimed to have seen a peeping Tom looking at them through their bedroom windows. During their initial search, the detectives found grass clippings on the living room carpet and a red thread dangling from the brick under the open window. However, there were no signs of a struggle like blood, broken glass, or overturned furniture, and everyone thought it was strange that Anne hadn't screamed during the abduction. They then asked 3-year-old Mary if she knew what happened to her sister since she slept in her bedroom that night, but unfortunately she was either too young or asleep to tell them anything. Before long, hundreds of searchers were scouring buildings in the area. Meanwhile, public utility workers and divers began searching the city's water bodies. At the same time, Don and his brother conducted their own search, which included a number of construction sites on the campus of the University of Puget Sound just a few blocks away. Despite all these searches though, they came up with nothing. As the investigation continued, Bev and Don agreed to take polygraph tests. Some sources claimed that the test administrators detected intentional deception, but they were both eventually cleared of any involvement after subsequent tests revealed they were being entirely truthful. Sometime later, the early edition of the Tacoma News-Tribune included a short piece about Anne's disappearance, and then when the late edition came out, it included a more comprehensive article and a photo of Anne smiling. Investigators were then flooded with dozens of news tips and leads every day, but sadly, most of them turned out to be dead ends. Despite the limited evidence, a number of suspects were looked at as the investigation continued. In the early going, one person of interest was the family's 15-year-old neighbor, Robert. It's unclear if Anne and Robert were friends or sweethearts, but some neighborhood kids claim they regularly called one another affectionate names like Loverboy and My Girl. However, Robert was also eventually cleared with a polygraph test. Now, for the record, polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable, but this was seen as solid evidence at the time. Tragically, for a few years after that, there was just nothing. But then in 1965, a prisoner in Oklahoma wrote the family a letter claiming that he and a friend kidnapped and killed Anne while working a farm in Washington in the summer of 1961. The family immediately gave the letter to detectives, and when they questioned the man, he agreed to take them to Anne's grave. The prisoner was then flown to Oregon in 1967, but by then, the landscape had been drastically altered by a major flood. As a result, the supposed grave was never found, and it's not clear if the man was actually telling the truth. With yet another disappointment behind them, investigators turned their attention to America's most notorious and prolific serial offender, and of all people, Ted Bundy. Under normal circumstances, this would be entirely far-fetched, but there are some strange and creepy incidents that tie him to the case. In the summer of 1961, the then 14-year-old Ted Bundy lived close to the family in North Tacoma. By then, he was already a peeping Tom in petty theft, but his first confirmed killing didn't occur until 1974. However, it has been speculated that he started earlier than that. Ted was eventually sentenced in Florida, and while on death row, he was interviewed by journalists, psychiatrists, and law enforcement officials. On multiple occasions between 1980 and 1981, he claimed to have abducted and killed a girl from Tacoma who lived near an orchard. There is a book called The Only Living Witness that was based on these interviews. When Bev read this book, she immediately wrote him a letter imploring him to come clean about his involvement in Anne's disappearance since he had nothing left to lose. And shortly thereafter, she got a response. Ted Bundy thanked her for her letter but told her she'd been misled by rumors. According to him, he was a normal teenager when Anne went missing and he had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance. But if you know anything about him and serial offenders in general, they are notorious liars. And this could be about something happening that is claimed not to have happened or vice versa, making it difficult to judge what is true and what isn't. So that alone is not great evidence. However, during an interview with Professor Dr. Ronald Holmes years later, he once again claimed that his first victim was a girl of Anne's age who he stalked, kidnapped, assaulted, and strangled in Tacoma 3 decades before. Unfortunately though, again, it's impossible to know if this is true. Up until the very end, Bev and Don held out hope that his conscience would get the better of him and that he'd admit to abducting and murdering Anne, but sadly, he never did. All told, the Tacoma police conducted thousands of interviews, administered more than 100 polygraph tests, and followed up countless tips and leads. Officially, detectives worked the case for more than 5 years with no witnesses, no hard evidence, no credible ransom demand, no motive, and no body. After retirement, the main detective spent another 2.5 decades trying to crack the case. However, Don Burr died in 2003 and he was followed by Bev in 2008. Today, the case is still open with the Tacoma Police Department. Dave Bocks was born in Staten Island in 1944 and moved to Ohio as a kid and built a modest but steady life for himself. He married his high school sweetheart in 1966 and the couple had 3 children before divorcing in 1979. Although the marriage ended though, the relationship didn't crumble completely as Dave remained close to his ex-wife and deeply involved in his kids' lives. Those who knew him described him as fairly quiet and the kind of man who didn't stir up trouble but didn't ignore it either. Dave was eventually hired by the Feed Materials Production Center in nearby Fernald, Ohio in 1981 as a pipe fitter, and by 1984-39 he was a regular on the graveyard shift, working from midnight to 8:30 in the morning. That schedule meant his nights were spent wandering the quiet factory, inspecting equipment and making sure nothing was breaking down. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was reliable, and it put him in a position to see some things management didn't want talked about. Locals simply called it the plant, and most of them assumed it was just another factory making some vague industrial products. In truth, however, it was one of the most secretive facilities in the United States. Although on paper it was operated by a contractor called National Lead of Ohio, the plant itself actually belonged to the Department of Energy. For nearly 4 decades, it was among the few US facilities refining uranium for the nation's weapons program, helping supply the Cold War arms race. As a result of this, workers were told not to talk about what they did, even to their families, and management downplayed the risks. They said the radiation levels were too low to even bother mentioning. It was supposedly nothing to worry about, so workers were encouraged to go about their business, and they did, most of them anyway. On the night of Sunday, June 18th, 1984, Dave followed his usual routine. At 11 p.m., he met up with his rideshare partner and friend, Harry, in the parking lot of a local restaurant. By 11:25 p.m., the pair had arrived at the facility, and moments later they were inside the staff locker room with their belongings stowed and their uniforms on. At midnight, Dave checked in at the maintenance room and got his orders. He was supposed to look at a pump in plant number 8 that had been giving the crew some trouble. He then popped open his toolbox and tossed the padlock along with his keys aside, leaving them visible as he prepared for the night's assignment. Around 4 a.m., another worker spotted Dave sitting in a truck with his supervisor, Charlie. The worker thought it was strange that the two men seemed to be having a serious conversation with the truck's windows rolled up, even though the night was sweltering. Sometime later, Dave and Harry clocked out on their lunch break together and then punched back in at 4:46 a.m. before heading in different directions again. This would be the last time Harry ever saw his friend. The next sighting came from another employee who noticed Dave walking across the grounds, not toward Plant 8 where he was supposed to be, but toward Plant 4. A little while later, Charlie ran into him again there, and the two were seen speaking for about 10 minutes. They too then went their separate ways, and that was it. At around dawn, Harry started to know something wasn't quite right. He hadn't seen Dave in hours, which was unusual. Even on nights when they were assigned to different areas, they usually crossed paths at some point. At 7 a.m., when a safety meeting was held in Plant 4, Dave didn't show. That was odd enough to make Harry uneasy, but he brushed it off, assuming maybe Dave was tied up with overtime work. Then when Harry headed back to the maintenance building, his worry grew. Dave's toolbox was still sitting open, lock and keys exactly where he'd left them at the start of his shift. It seemed that his belongings hadn't moved at all. Trying not to panic though, Harry wrapped up his shift and went about his day. Before leaving, he mentioned to a security guard that he had to make an appointment and couldn't stick around, but asked him to let Dave know that he'd swing back later. After the appointment, Harry returned to the plant as promised, but no one had seen any sign of Dave while Harry was gone. Harry then left a note for Dave with the security that read, quote, "Dave, waited till 10:45, finally went home, sorry." As all of this was going on elsewhere in the plant, something strange was happening. Around 7:30 that morning, a furnace operator in one of the plants complained to his supervisor. The casings in his oven were coated with a sticky residue, and there was a smell he didn't recognize. The supervisor, however, dismissed the concern and told him to get back to work, and the furnace continued to roar on. At 11 p.m. that night, when Harry stopped by the restaurant where he and Dave usually met to carpool, Dave's car was already there. At first, this was relief. It wasn't uncommon for Dave to show up early and get something to eat at the restaurant or pick something up for his lunch, so Harry figured he was inside. It was also Dave's turn to drive, so Harry walked over to Dave's car and leaned against the fender to wait for him. Immediately though, he noticed it was stone cold, and so was the hood. The car clearly hadn't been driven for hours. At this point, Harry's worry finally tipped over into alarm. He drove to the plant and reported Dave missing to security the moment he arrived at the facility. Security got to work right away looking for Dave, and one of the first things they did was pry open Dave's locker. Inside were the clothes that Dave had worn the night before, left untouched. A full search of the facility then turned up nothing, and with no sign of Dave anywhere, company officials finally called the police. When police arrived at the plant, they didn't have to dig far before something unsettling came to light. Records from Plant 6 showed that at 5:15 on the morning Dave disappeared, the furnace temperature, which normally kept steady at 1350 degrees, had suddenly dropped by 28 degrees, not once but twice. The dip was small enough to correct itself quickly, but big enough to suggest that something foreign had been dumped inside. An engineer also later noted that the furnace's clocks ran about 10 minutes fast, meaning the drop had really happened closer to 5 a.m. That just so happened to be around the time Dave was last seen. The implication was obviously chilling. Was Dave the sudden cause of the temperature drops? At first, it seemed too horrifying to believe, but 3 days later, when the furnace was shut down and allowed to cool, investigators began to sift around the hardened waste inside. What they pulled out erased any lingering doubt. There was a fragment of an eyeglass frame, a steel toe from a boot, an alligator clip from a name tag, and pieces of Dave's walkie-talkie. His keys were also found in the furnace, twisted and burnt. 3 of them belonged to padlocks traced back to him, and a 4th key, possibly to his house, was bent and warped beyond recognition. Most disturbing of all, though, among the debris were fragments of bone, so charred by the furnace's heat they crumbled like ash. One other discovery stood out as especially odd, which was a piece of stainless steel wire looped into 3 interlocking circles. No one could explain what it was or how it ended up in the furnace along with the other items. But either way, the sheriff's department concluded what most had feared. Dave was dead and seemed to have been consumed by a machine built to melt metal. After the discovery, an investigation began, but almost immediately, the details didn't line up. Harry remembered clearly that Dave's keys had been sitting on his toolbox long after the time the furnace registered its drop in temperature. When he left work well after 5 a.m., which again is when Dave is believed to have gone missing, they were still there. By the time he came back that night, they were gone, so somehow between then and when investigators sifted through the furnace, they had ended up inside along with Dave. So once the remains were pulled from the furnace, the official question became how Dave died. Investigators immediately floated the idea that Dave had decided to end things on his own. On paper, there were reasons to believe this. Dave's medical history gave investigators something to hang on to. Years earlier, he had been treated for schizophrenia, and during his divorce, he struggled with alcohol and once made an attempt to end things before. Charlie also told police that Dave looked downcast that night. This was enough for authorities to sketch out the narrative that Dave had maybe climbed the furnace ladder and jumped in, but almost everyone who actually knew Dave pushed back. Dave's daughter pointed out that her father had made concrete plans for the future, bought enough cigarettes to get him through the week, and even paid his bills for the month. Dave's psychiatrist also even flatly said that he was not prone to such ideations despite his condition. And finally, Harry, who had spent a fair portion of the night with Dave, said that nothing about Dave's demeanor that night suggested a man on the brink. Maybe most importantly though, the mechanics of this theory didn't line up. The furnace access slot was tiny, just 9 inches by 22 inches, hardly enough for a grown man to force himself through. The top of the furnace also stood 4 feet high, meaning Dave would have had to climb up a ladder, squeeze himself through the narrow slot, and somehow slide entirely inside, all while facing unimaginable heat. Doctors and scientists consulted later noted it was nearly impossible for someone to maneuver through an opening like that unaided. And the more they thought about it, the less sense it made. That left a much darker possibility, which was that someone else had done it. One plant employee told police he believed there was no way Dave had ended up in the furnace on his own. He was convinced that Dave was lowered in, already dead or unconscious. An investigative reporter who had been covering the news at the plant for years came to a similar conclusion. He believed that Dave had either been shot or knocked out before his body was disposed of in the furnace, and that the cover-up went straight to the top. And Dave's family leaned even further into this theory. They suspected he'd been dismembered and placed into the furnace in stages, which they believe explained the 2 separate temperature drops. They also suspected that he'd been targeted because he was preparing to blow the whistle on the plant's radioactive releases. Dave was apparently staunchly rule-following. He apparently even complained to Charlie about another employee he caught sleeping on the job. That stubborn streak, his family believed, made him a threat to people who had secrets to protect. As mentioned before, management downplayed the risks of the factory. And as it would turn out, by the fall of 1984, just a few months after Dave's death, a factory accident sent a massive cloud of radioactive smoke into the atmosphere, drawing public attention to what was really going on at the plant for the first time. An investigation would later reveal that the plant had been leaking poison into its own backyard for decades, and officials had allegedly known about it. It's been speculated that Dave found out what was going on there and was prepared to blow the whistle. Police, however, refused to call it a homicide. Without evidence of a struggle, without a suspect, and with Dave's past mental health history, they stuck with the theory that Dave by his own doing. One detective even suggested that if anyone else tried to shove Dave into the furnace, they would have burned themselves with how hot the furnaces were kept. As you might imagine though, this conclusion didn't satisfy the people who knew him best. In the months after Dave's death, the investigation fizzled and the police never pressed forward with charges. In September of 1984, just 3 months after Dave vanished into the furnace, his family tried to have him declared legally dead so they could manage his estate. By that time, police were no longer actively investigating, but even so, the coroner's office refused to issue a death certificate because of the lack of substantial physical remains. It would take nearly 2 more years before a probate court finally declared him legally dead in March of 1986. On top of that, the family was even stuck without a body to memorialize or bury properly. Pieces of Dave had been found, but what was left of him couldn't be safely put underground. The furnace not only destroyed most of his body, but it had poisoned it as well. The remains were so contaminated with radioactive particles, they were considered hazardous waste. So instead of being laid to rest in a cemetery, Dave's bones were packed into a contaminant drum and sent to Nevada to be stored with radioactive waste from the nation's nuclear weapons program. 5 years later, in 1989, the plant was shut down amid the growing scandal over the radioactive releases it had been hiding from the public. To this day, to many, what exactly happened to Dave remains a complete mystery. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.